So I'm in the rise of rhetoric here, and as I try to mention, I think, or emphasize in the last video, that we want to be thinking about rhetoric as something that humans do together, first and foremost, and then the class that we're taking is kind of focusing on the efforts to try to codify or theorize or systematize that behavior, that social practice. But this distinction between rhetoric as practice and rhetoric as theory is important. And this is a class that's looking at theories of rhetoric, but it all starts with practice. And the birth of rhetoric as a kind of new human social phenomenon emerged, as it's noted here, along with these kind of new structural reforms. The big story is rhetoric came into existence as these Greek city-states were shifting from aristocracy and oligarchy to a more democratic kind of social arrangement. It's not a perfect democracy. It's not a broad democracy. It's a limited democracy. But it is the first example of it that we have in the West, right? And so it's important, I think, that rhetoric comes together with this new kind of social arrangement where citizens, our free citizens, are able to defend and accuse and inspire and plead with one another, and the theories come into being to better shape and better guide and better make sense of what's happening in those new social spaces and social structures. We've got courts, we've got assemblies. These are the important spaces where this new activity was happening, right? And so it came into being, rhetoric came into being because things are opening up, socially speaking. I always think about Kenneth Burke's line that rhetoric is necessary only insofar as we're free, meaning that you can't or even not need to bother persuading someone if they're not free to think differently or act differently or disagree or challenge or whatever, right? So because we have ostensibly free citizens or a select group of society that are able to disagree, refute, challenge, right? Rhetoric now becomes necessary. And it becomes practice, and the citizens become aware of this new practice, and that gives rise to the theory, and that's kind of what we're looking at here, right? So citizens defending their claims in court, and that first chunk under the rise of rhetoric. So we're talking about political structural changes with Cleisthenes is mentioned here, Solon, major political reforms in Athens. We have a new educational system that emerges to feed the needs of this new social practice in terms of, like, how do we do this? How do we think about this? Instruction, guidance, right? This is where the sophists kick in. We'll get to that in just a second here. But in the Athenian democratic reforms subsection, there's another, actually, one after that called Polis and Politics. Right before that, there's a paragraph that says, while women, slaves, and foreigners were conspicuously excluded from power, cracks were beginning to appear in the walls separating ruling elites and the general public. And that word cracks, I think, is important because on the one hand, we looking back from today, we see this new democracy, and we see it as a very limited democracy. Lots of, in fact, even the majority of people didn't get to participate in this activity, and yet at the same time it was the first opportunity for lay citizens, the non-noble, the non-aristocratic, to actually gain some kind of middle-class power and use it to kind of challenge power, right? And so in some senses we look back and we see this time as limited, exclusionary, right? Certainly far from the kind of democracy that we might hope for. But on the other hand, it's the kind of the first flowerings of this new kind of social activity and social arrangement where normal citizens were able to wield the powers of language and persuasion to make arguments, to challenge, to do things differently, to sort of lead citizens in different directions. And that's kind of cool and exciting. This term in the next section, polis and politics, isagoria, is quite interesting. Every free male citizen enjoyed the right of isagoria, a guarantee of the opportunity to speak freely in public assemblies. This is sort of tipping teeing up the Arendt piece that we'll get back to in a second. This idea of having the kind of the guarantee, the structural guarantee, this place and this kind of social sanctioning of citizens coming together and speaking freely is quite powerful and interesting. So that's important. The rhetoric and democracy and court systems and educational reform are all kind of happening together. And so where we see this kind of cultural flowering of ideas and newness and disagreements and jostling and so on, that's where the action of rhetoric really kicks in. And so we see that in this period of Athens, of this kind of flourishing of Athenian culture, corresponding with new thinking about rhetoric and persuasion. All right, so we got courts and assemblies. That's pretty good here. The sophists. This is kind of what we're interested in here for this week, is sort of the origins of rhetoric. The first teachers, practitioners, experts in this new thing called rhetoric were this kind of collection of individuals that we call the sophists, right? So let's spend a bit of time thinking about what that is. 9 minutes, okay. So the sophists, the translation is like wise guy or learned person, or, you know, somewhere in there, right? It's like sort of like handy word for professor or something. Today they have the word sophist has a kind of negative connotation. Basically, if someone's referring to someone as a sophist, they basically mean that person is a manipulator, a mistrustful person, is a maybe slippery and deceptive, or like a player, or, you know, someone who just can't really be trusted, is a little slippery, right? The word itself is more like just learned, wise person. But the particular kind of wisdom that the sophists were practicing and sharing and actually getting quite wealthy off of is worth noting, right? And so we talked about these four major traditions in rhetoric, and the Gorgianic tradition is the one that's going to kind of represent the sophistic tradition. First thing, you know, you want to remember about the sophists is it wasn't like a unified group of individuals. These are people that traveled around, came from different places. They just saw kind of like free market opportunity where these new arts and talents and practices and principles and techniques of persuasion were being practiced, and sort of went to that action and offered their training and did very well, right? So it was a kind of an exciting time. This kind of new kind of social playground is taking shape, and the sophists were there. They were the ones in the action. Their reputation. So with all of the models, I don't know if I quite hit this point, but with each of the four models, you can think about them in terms of like a good version and a bad version, right? So there's a good way of interpreting the sophistic or Gorgianic model, and there's a kind of negative way of interpreting the model. And we get kind of each of these characteristics can kind of go in different directions, right? So for example, they were foreigners. A lot of the sophists were foreigners to Athens. They came from outside, and they brought different kinds of ideas, values, norms, different traditions and ways of doing things and thinking about things. And so this way, they were seen as sort of disruptive and even as maybe even dangerous, right? Bringing sort of foreign ideas. Today, you know, we live in Las Vegas, a major cosmopolitan city. We care a lot about sort of different walks of life and difference and diversity and so on. So we think this as, I would presume, a pretty good thing, but you can also see this idea of like fear of strangers or fear of others, right? So the sophists had a reputation as being sort of different and promoting different kinds of ideals and so on. They were very playful and experimental. This is in the sophist reputation subsection there. Playful, experimental. They played with language. They played with ideas. They encouraged playfulness in their instruction and their students. We'll see this in the Gorgium of Helen when we actually go into it. that there's a playfulness of language, there's a playfulness with style, and there's also a playfulness with ideas and what can be thought. And this idea, don't forget about contingencies, right? Things can be different, things can be otherwise. So the sophistic model is really about sort of pushing against accepted ways of thinking and doing things. And so again, you can see a kind of happy version of this and a sort of dark version of this. The happy version is that these are kind of progressive educators and professionals and experts and so on, and they're really kind of challenging traditions, right? And they're even kind of politically kind of resistant to dominant, ways of thinking and doing things. So we could maybe hook into that idea that these guys were kind of ambitious politically and culturally and so on, but then they also represented a kind of a threat, right? And so there's different ways of interpreting that. They did not seem to, again, it's hard to generalize different approaches, but generally speaking, the sophists were not known to be, Aristotelian or Platonic in the sense that their knowledge can be relied upon either in a kind of certain sense or a probabilistic sense. Again, contingencies, right? So truth can be this today, that tomorrow. We'll see this in dysoilogoi quite a bit, right? This idea that, like, what's true really just sort of depends on where you're standing, who you are, what your interests are, what your particular buy-in is to a situation, what side of a problem you're on, right? So there's no real truth. It's just sort of like how you're coming at something, right? So in terms of their priorities, the sophists were really about eloquence. When you think of eloquence, think of style and delivery and artistry, right? So saying things really artfully, high, premium placed on performance and display, and just sort of fantastical, right? It's just like, this is the idea of rhetoric as just sort of pure linguistic power, eloquence, right? And in a very elastic sense. So this idea that we can do whatever we want if we just wield the powers of language and style appropriately or ambitiously enough. Yeah, so how sophists taught, never mind, dysoilogoi. Why were they controversial? So this is the section, the last section before two influential sophists, it looks like. And I've covered a lot of this already, right? So they had different ideas about justice, they had different ideas about truth, they had different ideas about tradition, they represented different cultures, they were foreigners, outsiders. They also got pretty wealthy by offering these new teachings in rhetoric at a fair market price, right? And this was the juice, this was the game of the time. And so they did quite well, and they took a lot of heat. Imagine people coming from out of town, teaching your sons, your young men how to do this new thing, but how to do it in a kind of like, what are you doing? This is not okay. This is not good. You're just showmanship. You're just showing off. You're using these powerful arts of language and persuasion to lead, audiences astray and so on. So they cause a ruckus, right? Debased understanding of truth, dangerous element in Athens. They were paid parasites. We've covered this. Foreigners. This idea of cultural relativism kicks in when you think about people coming from elsewhere with their different values and practices and traditions, and basically saying, hey, there's no one right way of doing anything. So this is what gives rise to this idea of cultural relativism, which is there's no standards, there's no consistent kind of reliable way of thinking or relating to one another, or there's nothing that's better or worse. Cultural relativism is what leads other cultures to say of other cultures, just because they might do terrible things to their children, we can't judge because, they do things differently, right? So this idea of cultural relativism is like no standards, no unity, no center to how we try to live our lives, and no authorities and so on, right? So it's sort of like anarchy. So the sophists then, for a very long time, had a really kind of rotten reputation as charlatans, outsiders, deceivers. They were just sort of like snake oil salesmen coming from out of town and selling this these empty tricks. That's what Plato would say, right? But there's another way of thinking about them. Their reputation has been rehabilitated in the last several decades, going back to like around the 1980s. Scholars in rhetoric were kind of going back, especially to Gorgias, and seeing him with kind of a different lens, and seeing the sophists all of a sudden as kind of cultural allies of, think about the civil rights movement and so on, right? The sophists were the original thinkers about rhetoric that who best allied with the kinds of political challenges and resistance that was hot back in the, coming out of the 70s and 80s. So all of a sudden, it was really interesting back in the 1980s and 90s. There's a bunch of books and articles coming out that were kind of rethinking the sophists and going back and saying, actually, they had a lot more important things to say and to show us than we think, right? Aristotle is not the only model, or Cicero is not the only model. The sophists, and Gorgias in particular, and maybe Protagoras, have lots that we can actually hook into, that we can use today, that helps us today. So today, the sophistic model is a very important and dominant one. And it's going to be interesting to kind of track some of their ideas and think about them in play today, right? So I'm already at, 20 minutes. I'll see if I can do Arendt pretty quickly. I've got some notes that I will, I got to clean them up a little bit, and I'll put them on our webpage that correspond with this reading. But the basic gist of this Arendt reading, just take a step back. Hannah Arendt was one of the great political philosophers of the 20th century. She came out of Europe. She was part of the Jewish diaspora coming to the States. Out of the Second World War, right? And she ended up writing some astonishing things about power, totalitarianism. She wrote a series of papers for the New Yorker coming out of the trials coming out of the Second World War. And she coined the phrase, the banality of evil, when she was looking at the Nazi regime and the court proceedings over what had happened during the war. What she noticed was, like, evil does not necessarily come in the form of like a big dragon, fire breathing. It's like the banality of evil is like the accounting records, and like the low level, just like the ways that these terrible ideas would take shape in very concrete, logistical, specific ways. It's like Schindler's List with the typewriter and the ledgers, that kind of stuff. So she was brilliant philosopher, and this book, The Human Condition, is a masterpiece, right? So we're just looking at a tiny little piece of this, and what she's doing is she's sharpening up our analysis of the kind of structural situation and the social and spatial situation of rhetoric's origins. And basically, just sort of cut to the chase here, she's talking about the distinction between the public and the private realm. And the point that she's really making is that back in the ancient context, you can imagine, people lived kind of on the outskirts of the city, and then they would have their homes and they would have their kind of basic necessities taken care of in home, and then they would step away from the home, which was considered the private realm, that realm of the household, right? And then they would kind of, these were the men who were the head of the home. Once the sort of basic necessities of life were taken care of, then they were able to kind of step away from that space and step into the space of the polis, P-O-L-I-S, which is the kind of the virtual space of the community, right? It's not necessarily a physical space, although the polis happens, in courts and in assemblies and in the kind of the common spaces where citizens gather and commingle and plead with one another and persuade and so on. That's the polis, right? So the polis was very distinct from the home. That's the key idea here. She even uses the word gulf at some point. I'm going to have a hard time finding it. If I do, I'll let you know. But the idea here is that there was a gulf, like an actual kind of chasm that separated the home from the polis or the public. So the private was one realm. The public was another completely different realm, totally separate, totally distinct, right? The home was the space of necessity. Think about food, think about shelter, think about disease, birth, death. It's the life world, right? So what we do in the home is we take care of our basic necessities. There's no freedom in the home because all you're doing, there's this show on Netflix I was watching about like people who live close to the the Arctic Circle in Alaska, right? And it's fascinating to see how they live their lives. And they're always saying, like, I'm free, like, I don't have to worry about society and all that crap. And at the same time, like, the only thing they care about is getting enough food for winter, right? It's like getting enough fish, getting enough fuel, getting enough, you know, whatever. It's like, okay, you're kind of free in a sense, but you're also like, everything you're doing is about taking care of the sort of the necessities of life. And that's very much what the household was about in the ancient context. So that was a space of hierarchy, of dominance. The man was the head of the household, and then, you know, the woman was the partner, and maybe they had some workers or slaves even, and so on, right? And it was a very kind of hierarchical arrangement. It was a space of necessity, therefore not a space of freedom, not a space of equals, even a space of violence, and, you know, like, we must take care and do what we have to. The polis, qualitatively different, right? This is a space of equals coming together. The idea is, like, once you step away from the home, you're now stepping into this, or stepping up into. For Arendt, it was a very special, privileged opportunity to go in and engage as equals, as free equals together, to engage in the business of the good life. Right? And so the home is like taking care of your basics, and then the polis is where we go to risk our I don't know, our sense of, like, commitment to the community and so on, right? That's the space of greatness, she says. That's the space of excellence. It's the space of speech, right? So she talks a little bit about rhetoric. And so what we do in the polis, what we do in the public, is we come together as free citizens, and we attempt to achieve greatness, essentially, for the purposes of the community, the greater good idea, right? And it's really interesting because she has lots of great things to say about the public and the polis, right? It's excellence. It's where excellence happens. It's where speech and action, the word action is important for Arendt. Action is different from work, which is what happens in the home. We're just taking care of the basics. Work and labor, that's all drudgery. Action is willed, and it's conscious, and it's what free citizens do. They come together. They give speeches. They come up with big plans, big ideas. Think about, like, the Olympics, right? This is sort of the arena of greatness and so on. So Arendt really kind of privileged and cherished the polis in the ancient context. But it's kind of awkward because you don't get that unless you first have this other space, this sort of preconditional space of unfreedom and sort of bare necessity, bare life kind of idea. So the one that was great kind of required the other in order to exist. You couldn't be a citizen unless you had a home, you know, and some sort of basic comfort, basic material comforts, right? And so there was this kind of, even though it was like the middle class, there was a certain level of achievement and what we might call privilege and access right off the bat, right? So it's a kind of a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, this idea of the public as a space of excellence and great speeches and freedom and accomplishment and going for it is like, yeah, wouldn't that be nice to see something like that today? You're doing it for the good of the order. You're doing it for the good of the people and the public and the community, right? And it's a kind of risk that you're taking. But you can't do that unless this other stuff has been sort of brutally taken care of. And so that's the arrangement that we want to be thinking about here, is like, what does it take to be able to engage in efforts that benefit the community, right? And what needs to be taken care of first? And where is this business of the public today? Because as the rest of this chapter proceeds, we're not going to bother with this, but she talks about the rise of the social. Moving into the modern period, we lose that distinction between the public and the private, and now we have this new thing called the social, and it's kind of like it erases those old distinctions. Now, we don't know what the difference is between the public and the private. We have politicians who are reality TV stars. Meanwhile, we have in the private sphere, we have real serious concerns about, access to medical care and so on and so on. So those old distinctions no longer apply. It's all social now, right? And so the question becomes, for rhetoric and for politics, where is the public? Where is the political? And, how do we think of questions about like action and excellence and the greater good and so on? I could go a lot deeper into Arendt. I mean, she's just like really, really brilliant, and this is dense kind of stuff. But that's the kind of the broad strokes picture. I always try to bring in this Arendt reading when we're going back to the ancient context, just to kind of remind ourselves that, like, there's never any kind of a perfect system. So even though it's like, yay, democracy, it's the birth of democracy, it's like, it's not so clean and simple, right? It came with sort of goods and bads. The goods were like free citizens, middle class, challenging authority, the ability to reason and persuade and influence, yay. But on the other hand, it's sort of happening on the backs of the majority of the rest of the public or the people who weren't able to participate, right? So it's a very kind of incomplete first attempt, but it gets the ball rolling in terms of rhetoric and democracy. So when I think about rhetoric, I always think about it in relation to democracy, in relation to the public, in relation to questions of action, in relation to questions of the greater good, right? And that's a good way for us all to be thinking about it.